Baltimore, 1996. In a solitary, secluded corner of the city, a small burger stand attracted late-night passers-by. With no visible sign or anything indicating its name, the place looked improvised. A rusty little grill, a second-hand refrigerator, and a stocky man serving customers with a chilling smile and a piercing gaze. That night, the atmosphere was especially tense, and the air, laden with an intense aroma of grilled meat, promised more than just a simple hamburger. Customers arrived at the stand, drawn by the smell of food and the promise of a quick, cheap meal. In the dim streetlights, the man calmly served each burger, carefully observing the reactions of those who, unknowingly, were participating in an indescribable horror. Each bite revealed a juicy and distinct flavor, yet no one suspected that each mouthful contained a dark secret. Joe Metheny, the man behind the counter, seemed to revel in his customers' innocent trust. He knew that once they tasted the meat from his stand, they would never be able to erase that flavor from their minds. The delight he felt in feeding others human flesh was a secret he carried with twisted pride. No one wondered what made the burgers unusually good. Some even praised the flavor, calling them the best in Baltimore. Joe, with a barely contained smile, listened in silence, letting his dark, bottomless eyes speak for him. Years earlier, Metheny's life seemed normal, monotonous even, but something had changed profoundly in him, something no one had noticed. What Baltimore didn't know was that this man, who now served food, had once been a truck driver in search of a better life, a husband and father with dreams that tragically vanished when his wife left him and took their son. The fury and resentment over that loss unleashed a boundless hatred that consumed and transformed him into the monster he had become. The loss of his son, the betrayal of his wife, and his aimless life on the streets pushed him to his limit. Metheny was, in others' eyes, just another man on the streets, one of thousands drifting between bars and alleyways, searching for a reason to exist. Yet, inside him, something darker was simmering. His life, once ordinary, was about to spiral irreversibly into the abyss. That burger stand would soon become the tool to transform his hatred into something tangible, something others would unknowingly taste. Joe Roy Metheny was born on March 2, 1955, in Baltimore, Maryland, to a working-class family. From his earliest memory, chaos and neglect marked his everyday life. His father, a man with severe alcoholism, was rarely around, and when he was, the violence he unleashed filled their home with constant, stifling tension. His mother, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to support her 6 children, trapped in endless shifts as a waitress, sometimes even as a food truck driver, anything she could do to earn a little extra money. Joe was one of the older children and, over time, learned to fend for himself in an environment where stability was nowhere to be found. At age 6, his life took a turn that plunged him further into darkness. His father died in a car accident. That event sealed the family's fate. Forced to take on the full economic burden, his mother had no choice but to work more hours, leaving the children alone or, at times, in temporary foster homes. For Joe, the absence of paternal affection and care was like a knife that left a lasting scar. Loneliness became his constant companion, and each day, his mind began to fill with dark thoughts that no one noticed. Years passed, and the absence of his parents, both in body and spirit, shaped Joe into a solitary, withdrawn young man who grew increasingly isolated. School offered no comfort or refuge. Though his teachers recognized a natural intelligence in him, his performance was constantly undermined by the lack of structure in his life. Joe began to seek solace in food, devouring everything he could find to fill an emotional void that, though invisible, consumed him day by day. Obesity soon followed, bringing with it teasing from his peers and a new kind of isolation that pushed him further to society's margins. At 18, he decided to join the army, a decision that, for many young people, represented a way out, a path toward a better life. But for Joe, it marked the start of another kind of hell. During his time in service, rather than finding the discipline to redeem himself, he found a new refuge in drugs. Soon, substances became his only escape. Though he served in the U.S. Army, his life was a mix of sleepless nights and hallucinations, of foggy days filled with anger he didn't know how to channel. Drugs became his solace, and in his mind, something even darker began to brew. When he finally returned to Baltimore, he did so as a changed man. He had seen the edge of the abyss and was barely hanging on by a thin thread of rationality. The lonely child he once was had transformed into a deeply resentful man trapped in a devastating addiction. However, his outward appearance, that large frame that had earned him the nickname Tiny among acquaintances, hid a tormented, poisoned mind. To his mother, he was a mystery, a figure she struggled to recognize, and though she tried to understand him, he only grew more distant. The image of his mother working endless hours, of his scattered siblings, and their absent home remained in his mind as pieces of a desolate story that haunted him. For Metheny, memories of his childhood and youth became seeds of latent violence, a deep anger that would soon find its release in the most brutal way. Metheny initially tried to stabilize his life. He found a job as a forklift operator at a wood pallet company, and although the work was tough, it gave him a semblance of routine, a slight reprieve from the instability in his life. For the first few weeks, he arrived on time, did his job in silence, and left without speaking to anyone. However, his colleagues soon noticed something strange about him. His towering 6'2", 300-pound frame intimidated anyone in his vicinity, and his emotionless face only reinforced the mysterious aura around him. He accepted the nickname Tiny without comment, as if it were just another blow he was meant to endure in silence. Despite his apparent job stability, Metheny spent his nights drifting from bar to bar, spending what little he earned on drugs and alcohol, attempting to forget the dark thoughts that consumed him. He frequented homeless encampments, where his addictions were met with camaraderie among those who had also lost everything. Among the tired faces and trembling hands of these outcasts, Metheny found a kind of twisted home in the darkness of Baltimore. It was in one of these camps that he met a woman, also lost to addiction, with whom he quickly entered a chaotic relationship. From this union, a child was born, a small boy who became the only light in Metheny's life. However, the relationship with the boy's mother was toxic, a mixture of abuse and codependency. Both shared the same addiction and fell into increasingly violent arguments, marked by bitter silences and repressed resentment. Metheny loved his son, but his life was too chaotic to offer him any semblance of stability. Even so, the boy's presence in the middle of that chaos became Metheny's only reason to try to hold himself together. But in July of 1994, reality hit him once again. After a long day at work, Metheny returned home only to find it empty. His partner had vanished, taking their son with her. Metheny was frozen in shock, engulfed in a deadly silence that paralyzed him. The anger quickly filled him as he realized she had taken the child, the only bond he had left with the life he once dreamed of. Despite his rage, he kept it to himself and spent weeks trying to find any trace of them, but his search proved fruitless. 6 months later, a man on the street gave him a lead. His ex-partner and son were living on the other side of town, in deplorable conditions. She, now fully consumed by her drug addiction, was under the control of a dealer who allegedly forced her into prostitution to feed her habit, and their son was exposed to a life of misery and abuse in her care. Metheny felt a dark fury begin to grow within him. He sought help through social services, tried contacting the police, but his own criminal record trailed him. He was seen as a problem himself, and his attempts to get custody of his son were quickly dismissed. The rage and helplessness devoured him completely. The man who had tried to put his life in order was now shattered, with no one willing to listen to his pain, and he felt his hatred transforming into an unstoppable need for revenge, to make others suffer as he was suffering. The streets of Baltimore became his hunting ground, and the world, for Metheny, was no longer a place to seek redemption. It had become a place to exact power through violence. Days later, Metheny learned that his ex and the drug dealer she was living with had been arrested for possession and use of drugs. His son had been taken into child welfare services due to the severe neglect he'd endured. Social services responded with a cold refusal. His criminal history and addiction issues made him unfit for custody. At that moment, Metheny's helplessness transformed into a burning hatred. His anger stopped being a passing emotion and became a personal mission. The days that followed felt like a dark descent into madness. Metheny no longer sought comfort or justice. Instead, the fury he had been suppressing found an outlet that was violent and devastating. He decided to seek out his ex-partner and all those he deemed responsible for his misery. If he couldn't recover his son, he would at least ensure that the pain he felt spread to everyone in his path. Metheny's despair was no longer just a shadow in his life. It had become a twisted, clear purpose. One night in late 1994, beneath a dirty, desolate bridge, Metheny encountered two homeless men who frequented the same circles as his ex. He saw in their worn faces, in their defeated bodies, an opportunity to unleash his anger. He approached slowly and, without preamble, asked for the whereabouts of his son's mother. The men, drunk and confused, barely understood the question, and Metheny, enraged by their lack of answers, lost control. Within minutes, his fury turned murderous. He attacked with everything he had, delivering brutal blows while his mind chanted his son's name. When he was done, the two men lay motionless on the ground. Metheny observed the scene with unexpected calm, feeling a dark satisfaction, as if every blow, every muffled scream, had momentarily filled the void that consumed him. With disturbing calm, he dragged the bodies to nearby bushes, hiding them among the trash and debris scattered there. That night, beneath that lonely bridge, Metheny crossed an invisible line, and although he didn't know it yet, his life would never be the same. The desire for vengeance that had motivated the attack transformed into a twisted craving for power. Metheny felt that by taking the lives of those men, he had gained control he had never experienced before. That night, he discovered that violence offered an escape that neither alcohol nor drugs had ever provided. He knew he wasn't done. His fury demanded more, and the night was still young. Before heading home, Metheny saw a woman walking alone on the dark streets. He recognized her as one of the local sex workers, an addict who also frequented the bridges where his ex used to hide. He stopped her and, under the pretense of offering money, led her to a secluded spot. Once again, he demanded information on his ex's whereabouts. When she claimed to know nothing, he exploded. He beat and overpowered her, releasing all his pent-up frustration and rage. Then, with chilling composure, he killed her and hid her body in nearby bushes. Still seething, he returned to the bridge where the first murders had taken place. That night became a cycle of hunting and unrestrained violence. Each moment, Metheny felt his hatred mingling with a strange sense of power. Any remorse, if he ever had any, completely vanished. He had become the monster he once feared, and the satisfaction he derived from it both horrified and exhilarated him. Joe Metheny's anger had erupted, and for him, there was no turning back. That first night of violence revealed to him something he had never experienced: the absolute power over life and death. It was a dark, intoxicating dominance that began to consume him. In his mind, images of his ex-partner and son intertwined with memories of his recent victims. And so, driven by an insatiable hatred, Metheny began to wander Baltimore's streets with a dark purpose. Weeks after the initial murders, his thirst for revenge led him back to Baltimore's underbelly. He submerged himself in the dark alleys, surrounded by shadowy figures, many homeless, addicts, and sex workers, unseen by most, but not by him. He knew that in those streets, he would find people linked to his ex or, at the very least, victims to satisfy his hatred and his new obsession. Metheny soon adopted a method to ensure the bodies would remain hidden. He dismembered his victims, burying pieces in various spots in the woods or under bridges, making sure nothing was visible. Occasionally, police would find human remains in abandoned areas, but they never connected them to him. Baltimore was a city plagued by poverty and violence, and the bodies that turned up appeared to the authorities as just another link in the city's chain of crime. Over time, Metheny began to experiment with something even more macabre. He would cut flesh from his victims and store it in plastic containers, stashing it in his trailer where no one suspected his dark purposes. In his mind, a sinister idea began to take shape. Not only could he enjoy his victims' deaths himself, but he could also make others unknowingly share in that horror. So, sometime in 1995, Metheny set his twisted plan in motion. He bought a portable grill, pork meat, and some condiments. Using the flesh from his victims, mixed with pork, Metheny prepared his first human flesh hamburgers. He set up his burger stand on a busy Baltimore street corner, where dozens of people passed by looking for cheap, quick food. No one suspected the origin of that meat. For Metheny, each bite someone took of his burgers was a reminder of his power, an affirmation that he held absolute control over others' lives and deaths. The customers, oblivious to the truth, praised the unique taste of his burgers, and Metheny relished the fact that his crime lay so close to people, literally in their mouths. The blend of human flesh and pork was enough to fool anyone's taste buds. No one noticed the difference, and the compliments he received drove him to continue. Joe Metheny's life had reached a new level of darkness. His first murder had opened a door he could no longer close, and the twisted pleasure he felt in dominating others became an obsession that consumed him. Each night on the streets of Baltimore, Metheny was an invisible threat, a hunter in search of new victims to satisfy his thirst for power. However, for him, murder alone was no longer enough. He needed the world to share his darkest secret, even unknowingly. By day, Metheny led a relatively normal life, working at the pallet factory where his boss trusted him enough to allow him to live in a small trailer on the property. No one suspected that this quiet, burly man, who performed his job without complaints, harbored a monstrous secret. But at night, the factory became his lair, and the small trailer he occupied transformed from a solitary refuge into a dark sanctuary where he planned his next crimes. The trailer, located in a secluded area of the factory grounds, was hidden from his co-workers' view. There, on Fridays and Saturdays, he sold his sinister specialties. To the casual observer, he was just a street vendor, but in Metheny's mind, he had created a shrine to horror, a place where he executed a silent revenge against the world. Metheny's crimes developed into a gruesome ritual. Each week, he sought new victims on Baltimore's streets and bridges. Over time, he focused primarily on sex workers and homeless individuals, people whom society had abandoned. He would approach them with an innocuous offer, promising food or money. But deep down, he knew none of them would leave his trailer alive. The attacks followed a methodical pattern. Metheny lured his victims to his trailer, where he subjected them to hours of physical and psychological abuse. His voice, usually low and barely heard at work, turned into a whisper that spewed threats, insults, and painful memories from his past, as though he were projecting onto them all the hatred he felt toward his ex-partner and his own failed life. Then, in a calculated moment of brutality, he ended their lives. Once they were dead, Metheny calmly set about dismembering them. With macabre precision, he cut the bodies into sections and selected the flesh he thought would best blend with pork for his burgers. The parts he deemed useless he buried in a wooded area behind the factory, ensuring they'd never be found. Every step was meticulously planned. Each action was another step in his transformation from man to monster. Metheny began experimenting with his meat blends. He noticed that human flesh had a distinct texture and flavor, but not so different from pork. This quality allowed him to create a blend he described as perfect. As he cooked, he felt a perverse pleasure, as if he were giving back to the world something that, in his mind, society owed him. When his customers bit into his burgers, Metheny reveled in the secret they shared unknowingly, a horrifying connection that made him feel invincible. On the nights he set up his stand, Metheny took delight in watching the expressions of those who tried his specialty. He received compliments from those savoring the meat without knowing its true origin. "Best burgers in Baltimore," some would say, and he would respond with a barely perceptible "thank you," while his gaze drifted over their faces, wondering if they would ever discover the truth. Most customers noticed nothing strange about the meat. Metheny ensured that the pork mixture masked the human flesh's distinctive taste, and he was right. The texture of human flesh added a subtle smoothness that, combined with the pork, fooled even the most discerning palates. Metheny's satisfaction didn't come from the sale itself, but from the fact that his crimes were literally being consumed in every burger he served. Rumors began to spread. Baltimore residents spoke of a burger stand with a different flavor. Some said the man behind the counter seemed like a specter, with his imposing figure and cold gaze. Others claimed the meat had a unique quality, not realizing how accurate that term was. Some even returned, drawn by the strange taste they couldn't replicate elsewhere. But instead of fearing that these rumors might raise suspicions, Metheny took pleasure in them. The attention his stand received fed his sense of power, and his arrogance grew. To him, every compliment, every returning customer, every mouthful enjoyed without suspicion was a form of absolute dominance over the lives of those he had hunted. However, Metheny knew that his fantasy of power couldn't last forever. The bodies were piling up, and while Baltimore was a city where the crimes against marginalized people often went unnoticed, the weight of his actions was starting to bear down on him. Rumors about the disappearances of sex workers and homeless people were spreading, and the tension in his daily life was increasing. His colleagues, who had once ignored him, began to notice subtle changes. His demeanor became darker, his gaze emptier, and his work absences more frequent. Nevertheless, Metheny couldn't stop. His compulsion overpowered him, and each hunt felt like he was teetering closer to completely losing control. He knew that with each crime, the risk of being caught grew, but, strangely, that danger also excited him. It was as if he were playing a game with his life at stake, and the thrill of walking that dangerous line made him feel more alive than ever. By late 1995, rumors of the disappearances reached Baltimore's southern neighborhoods. Families of the victims began voicing their concerns, worried about the lack of response from authorities, who seemed to ignore any connection between the cases. But Metheny, lurking in the shadows, felt untouchable. He believed the world was too indifferent, too absorbed in its own concerns to care about justice for those whom society had already forgotten. On one of his hunting nights, Metheny encountered a young sex worker named Kimberly. Kimberly Spicer was barely 23, with a tragic past of abuse and addiction. Metheny approached her with the same cold deception as he had with others, offering her money to accompany him. Unsuspecting, Kimberly agreed, but once inside the trailer, she was plunged into a nightmare beyond imagination. Metheny questioned her about people she didn't know, demanded names and answers she couldn't possibly give. When his fury erupted, he stabbed her with such brutality that death came almost instantly. With chilling composure, he hid her body, knowing he would dismember it later. Despite having perfected his method, Metheny made a mistake that night. A man living near the factory had seen Kimberly enter the trailer, and when she didn't reappear for days, he approached Metheny, asking about her. Confident his secret was safe, Metheny lied, claiming she had left shortly after arriving. But the witness remained on alert, remembering the ominous figure and the trail of rumors that had started to surround Metheny. Paranoia began to creep in, slowly but surely. Metheny was methodical, but he knew that at any moment, a misstep could betray him. For the first time, the pressure of being discovered and the possibility of losing his business weighed heavily on him. In his confused, arrogant mind, he even began to consider the idea that those around him might pose a threat. At one point, he thought about killing his boss, the man who had provided him shelter in the trailer and shown him trust. But Metheny, knowing that his boss's attention could turn toward him at any moment, decided to wait. On the night of December 8, 1996, Metheny prowled Baltimore's streets in search of new prey. That's when he crossed paths with Rita Kemper, a woman in a vulnerable situation, struggling with drug addiction, and, like many others, living on the fringes of society. Metheny used his usual tactic, offering her food, money, and a safe place to spend the night. Unaware of the horrors that awaited her, Rita accepted the offer and followed him to his trailer on the pallet factory's grounds. Once inside, Metheny locked the door and dropped his mask of apparent kindness. His intentions quickly became clear when he tried to assault Rita, and when she resisted, his face twisted in rage. Rita realized, in that instant, that her life was in grave danger. Enraged by her defiance, fueled by hatred and disdain, Metheny began to beat her mercilessly. He controlled her every movement with his overpowering strength, hissing threats as he forced her to stay still. Rita, on the verge of despair, searched frantically for a way out, any chance to escape from the death trap she'd entered. Then, in a moment that no one could have predicted, the situation took a sudden turn. While Metheny was distracted, searching for something to restrain her, Rita seized the split second when his attention wavered. With a desperate burst of energy, she broke free from his grip and ran toward the trailer door. Metheny, caught off guard by her sudden move, tried to grab her, but Rita managed to open the door and dart into the darkness of the night. Barefoot and frantic, Rita sprinted away, her heartbeat pounding like drums in her ears. She reached the perimeter fence, topped with barbed wire, and despite the pain it would cause, her instinct to survive pushed her to climb it. Metheny emerged from the trailer, blinded by rage, and tried to chase her, but to his shock and frustration, he saw Rita slipping to the other side of the fence, disappearing into the shadows. Wounded, bruised, and bleeding from cuts on her hands and feet, Rita ran until she reached a road where, desperately, she waved down a passing car. The driver, horrified by her state, led her into his vehicle without hesitation and took her to a nearby gas station, where Rita was finally able to call the police. Through tears and broken words, she recounted to the officers what had happened in Metheny's trailer and how she had barely escaped the nightmare. When the officers arrived on the scene, Metheny's escape options were over. Though he had tried to clean the scene and remove any incriminating evidence, his behavior, coupled with Rita's detailed account, left no doubt. Within minutes, Metheny was handcuffed and taken to a police station. During the interrogation, he tried to deny everything, claiming that Rita had come to him willingly. But as detectives pressed him, noting the signs of guilt in his responses, he began to crack. Rita's testimony led the authorities to search not only the trailer but the entire pallet factory property. During their initial investigation, they found human remains and bones buried near the area where Metheny had worked for years. The police, horrified, realized the full scale of Metheny's crimes. As investigators unearthed more remains and pieced together the case, Metheny, aware that he had no escape, decided to talk. In custody, Joe Metheny began to confess to his crimes with chilling precision and a total lack of remorse, leaving officers shocked by the darkness that lay within him. Once in police custody, Joe Metheny was led to an interrogation room in Baltimore's police station. Under the dim light, he sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as two detectives watched him with apprehension. In front of them sat a towering, cold figure, his gaze fixed on a vacant point in the distance. Metheny's calm, unervingly collected demeanor disturbed the officers, who were beginning to sense the horrific scope of his crimes. With Rita Kemper's harrowing testimony and the grisly evidence unearthed at the factory, they were only starting to comprehend the darkness they were dealing with. The detectives opened with basic questions, hoping to provoke a reaction. Yet Metheny remained impassive, offering little more than curt replies. Initially, he denied all involvement, insisting that Rita Kemper had come to him willingly and that her story was pure fabrication. But as the detectives increased the pressure, bringing up the disappearances and discoveries around the factory grounds, his detached mask began to crumble. After hours of tense, uncomfortable silence and evasive answers, Metheny finally lowered his head and let out a dry, hollow laugh. Locking eyes with the detectives, he began to speak, almost daringly. What he revealed left them speechless and horrified as he began to confess, detailing each murder with a cold precision that exposed not just a lack of remorse, but a twisted pleasure in reliving each act. Metheny described his cycle of hunting, how he prowled Baltimore's darkest corners, targeting homeless individuals, sex workers, and addicts, those society had forsaken. In his voice, there was a perverse satisfaction as he recounted each encounter, each act of violence. He explained how he lured them to his trailer, turning it into a nightmarish trap, where he subjected his victims to unimaginable cruelty. As the detectives listened, stunned, Metheny continued, describing in detail his process of dismembering the bodies. He explained how he chose specific cuts of flesh to mix with pork, which he would later serve as burgers at his street stand. His words were devoid of emotion, as if he were merely reciting a recipe, and he even smiled coldly as he recalled his customers praising the unique flavor of his burgers. In a tone bordering on mockery, he boasted that no one had ever noticed the difference, and he savored the irony that everyday people unknowingly partook in his grim secret. Each sentence was more disturbing than the last, and as the details grew increasingly gruesome, one of the detectives had to leave the room. The horror of Metheny's confessions shattered their professional detachment, striking them deeply even with their experience in handling crime. Metheny's confession continued, describing how, sometime in 1995, he began selling his human flesh burgers. He outlined his meticulous preparation methods, explaining how he ensured the meat blended seamlessly with pork to mask the human flavor. Speaking in a casual tone, he boasted of how he watched customers devour his specialty, relishing the secret he shared with them unknowingly. Each compliment from a customer, each person who returned to his stand for more, fed his sense of dominance. Finally, the detectives pressed him for the locations of more bodies. In a blend of arrogance and defiance, Metheny provided specific locations around the factory grounds and in abandoned areas of Baltimore where he claimed to have buried additional remains. The police mobilized search teams, and soon, they began uncovering shallow graves just as Metheny had described. Each discovery confirmed the terrifying reality of his words, and the investigators found themselves confronting one of the most monstrous serial killers Baltimore had ever known. As his confession wound down, Metheny delivered a final, chilling statement, one that would haunt everyone in the room. The words "I'm sorry" will never leave my mouth because it would be a lie. I'm more than willing to give my life for what I've done, to let God judge me and send me to hell for eternity. I simply enjoyed it. His tone was steady, with no trace of regret, and his expression remained disturbingly calm. Joe Metheny's trial began in mid-1997, drawing nationwide attention that horrified Baltimore and the entire country. His unfeeling confessions, the grotesque nature of his crimes, and the revelation that he had unknowingly fed human flesh to unsuspecting citizens turned the case into a public nightmare. The courtroom was filled with journalists, victims' families, and police officers involved in the investigation, all desperate to see the monster who had relished his own sadism. Metheny appeared in court with the same chilling calm he had shown during his confessions. Though bound in handcuffs, his face remained expressionless, his gaze cold. Rita Kemper, the sole survivor of Metheny's brutality, testified at the trial. Her account was devastating as she recounted the night Metheny tried to kill her, the beating he inflicted, and the overwhelming terror that drove her to escape. She vividly described the paralyzing fear and the fierce determination that pushed her to scale the barbed wire fence and flee. Metheny was found guilty of the murders of Kathy Ann Magaziner and Kimberly Spicer, as well as kidnapping and related crimes. Initially sentenced to death, his sentence was later commuted to life without parole. Baltimore and the nation could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that this man would remain behind bars for the rest of his life. Joe Metheny was transferred to Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, to serve 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. On August 5, 2017, Joe Metheny's cycle of terror came to an unexpected end. That afternoon, prison guards found him dead in his cell, his body cold and lying at an odd angle on his cot. The cause of death was not immediately clear, and although his autopsy revealed no signs of foul play, the official report classified his death as unknown. The case of Joe Metheny remains a dark exploration of humanity's most horrifying depths, a story that forces us to question the lengths a person can go when hatred and violence become their reason for existing. Metheny was not just a serial killer. He embodied a void of empathy and compassion, a man who, by crossing into monstrosity, found satisfaction in the destruction of others and in challenging the very limits of human morality. His actions, devoid of remorse, demonstrate the corrosive power of vengeance and the degradation of the human spirit when life loses all meaning. His story also raises profound questions about society itself. Metheny preyed upon those who lived on Baltimore's margins, carrying out his crimes unnoticed for years, free from suspicion. This case reminds us that indifference, marginalization, and neglect can create fertile ground for cruelty. His victims were people invisible to most, people who found no help in life and, in death, struggled to receive justice. Metheny, in a sense, represents an extreme reflection of a system that, by overlooking its most vulnerable members, leaves space for horrors like this to grow. At the same time, his story serves as a warning about the thin line separating the ordinary from the terrible. I invite you to watch my next story,